The Torah tells us that when one has a Jewish slave or a Jewish maidservant and he lets them free, he has to give them ha'anaka, he has to give them gifts. The Pasuk says the reason, v'zacharta, you should remember you were a slave in Mitzrayim and Hashem, your Eibishter, took you out. Therefore, I'm commanding you to do this mitzvah. The Sifri says that just like Hashem had given the Yidden ha'anaka by Yetzias Mitzrayim, the spoils of Mitzrayim, and the spoils by the Yamsuf, so he gave them 2 sets of ha'anaka, so too when you free your slave, you should give them once and give them again. And just like Hashem gave you with an open and broad hand, so too you should give plenty also to your slave. The Rebbe says, if that's what the Pasuk is trying to tell us, that just like Hashem gave us all these gifts when we left Mitzrayim, we should give it to our servants, so it seems to be the main point is missing from the Pasuk. The Pasuk just says that Hashem took you out of Mitzrayim. It doesn't mention anything about the gifts in our Pasuk. In order to understand this, the Rebbe asks a number of questions on this Sifri regarding the halachas of ha'anaka, of giving gifts. Number one, there's a halacha that the gifts that we need to give to our slaves are things like produce, sheep, etc., things that can replenish themselves, things that multiply. It's called b'chlal bracha, not things like silver, gold, and money. And the spoils of Mitzrayim and the Yamsuf, it was the main things that they got was silver, gold, and clothing. Number two, the din of ha'anaka does not apply to someone that was a slave by a goy. Here, the Yidden were slaves to Mitzrayim. Number three, the ha'anaka is supposed to be from the master who had the slave. In our case, the Sifri is emphasizing that it's Hashem that gave the Yidden these gifts. How do we understand this? Says the Rebbe, a similar idea we also find in regards to Yosef. When Yosef goes out from his slavery, the Rebbe is making reference right now to a reshima, to notes of the Rebbe's father, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, who discusses the story, also ha'anaka, and he says what happened by Yosef. Yosef also got ha'anaka. Yosef was an Eved Ivri. Yosef is also a Yiddish slave, so he needs to get ha'anaka when he leaves. So the Rebbe's father explains that he first of all gets gifts from Paroi, who gives him his special ring and a special golden chain. Paroi gives him when making him second in command. The Rebbe's father goes on is that the main ha'anaka, the main gifts were actually given by Hashem by sending Gavriel, the Malach Gavriel, to teach him 70 languages. And then he goes on and say, and what about gifts from the master who is a slave by? So says the Rebbe's father, Poitifar, gives him his daughter Osnas as a wife. But again here, says the Rebbe, we have the same questions. First of all, Yosef is a slave to a goy. Why does he need ha'anaka? Number two, if the ha'anaka does need to come to from the master, why is the Rebbe's father saying that the main ha'anaka was coming from Hashem? And also, what about the gifts from Paroi? Why is Paroi giving gifts for the fact that he was a slave to Potiphar? And finally, the things that Paroi gives, the ring and the chain, and so too the 70 languages that Hashem gives, is again not what's called b'chlal bracha, they're things that replenish themselves. The Rebbe says, in fact, we could say that the basis for what the Rebbe's father is saying, that by Yosef was a din of ha'anaka, is based on the same Sifri, which is clearly seeming to implying that ha'anaka does apply in these types of situations as well, and this is what we need to understand. So the Rebbe says that in ha'anaka there's really 2 sides to the story. There's 2 aspects. There's one thing that the master has to give, which is more connected to the previous slavery, that this slave was working hard, and now the master is giving him something in recognition, almost like in payment for what he did. And then there's point number 2. What's the Eved benefiting from, and the pleasure that he's getting from this right now? And this is much more connected not with his previous slavery, but it's more part of his release and becoming a free man now. When he's given money now, possessions, when he's given whatever the gifts that he's given, now he can start feeling much more like a free person. He has his own money, he has his own wealth, etc. Says the Rebbe, it is this second aspect of ha'anaka that our pasuk is speaking about, that we're obligated in it because Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim. In other words, since Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim and gave us a full freedom, so we have that obligation as well to make sure that the slave that we are freeing is feeling completely free, and therefore giving him these gifts. Says the Rebbe, now we can understand how the spoils of Mitzrayim and the Yamsuf could be in a way of ha'anaka, and so too by Yosef. Says the Rebbe, since we're speaking mainly about the freedom of the slave himself, not so much about what the master is going to pay, so therefore, number one, it's not so relevant who was the previous master, and in our case, whether it was a Yid or a Goy. it's not so relevant who is the one giving the gifts. The main point is the fact that he's getting gifts, and that's showing on his state of freedom. And this will also explain why it doesn't necessarily need to be things that replenish themselves. Things that need to replenish themselves, that's more coming because of the obligation on the master. Because he needs to give something that will be noticeable for a long time afterwards, his appreciation, his recognition for the work that his slave did. But as far as the slave becoming a free man, the most important part is the moment when he becomes a free man. At this point, that he should feel completely free. Doesn't necessarily matter if a week or two later there's nothing left from that money. The main thing is that right now he got a complete freedom. He has all of this wealth. Says the Rebbe, this is what the Sifri is telling us, that you need to give and give again and with an open hand. Because if it was just as part of the obligation of the master, then you could say there's a certain maximum, how much you have to give. You showed your recognition, depending on how good the person worked, you gave something, and then you're done. But if we want, it's about the feeling that the slave is going to get, that it's being emphasized what kind of free person he is, then there's no limit. The more wealth he's going to get, the more of a free man he is going to be and he's going to feel. Says the Rebbe, now we can understand our original question, why it doesn't say in the pasuk about the wealth that the Eibishter gave the Yidden in Mitzrayim at the Yam Suf. Because what we're learning from the pasuk is not the quantity of what has to be given. What the message of the pasuk is that just like when Hashem freed you from Mitzrayim, He gave you complete freedom, completely being free people, which will automatically include wealth and all of that. But the main point is that He freed you completely. So too we have the obligation to ensure that when our slaves are freed, it should be in the most perfect way, and that's going to express itself when they're going to be given wealth and so on. Says the Rebbe, now we can also understand regarding Yosef. Even though his master is a goy, he still needs to get hanok, he needs to be getting gifts in order that he should feel, and that not only should feel, that the freedom should be a complete freedom. And when does he become completely free? So this is going to be by the hanok, by the gifts that Paro is going to give him, the ring, the golden chain, which through that he's appointing him as Mishnah Lamelech. That's the complete opposite of being a slave. That's the ultimate freedom. But in order for that to happen, in order to negate the complaints of the stargazers that were complaining this person is a slave, he doesn't even know 70 languages, etc. How could he be a king? So Hashem sends Malach Gabriel to teach him the 70 languages, which completely negates their complaints, and that's why that's considered the main ha'anaka. And then the Rebbe's father adds a bigger chiddush, that the ha'anaka has to be from the master, whom he was a slave to. Why? Because if he's now going to get gifts from the very person who considered him a slave before, that will emphasize his freedom even more. And that's why he gets asnats from Peitifar. But it's still nothing in comparison to the 70 languages and the fact that Pari appoints him as Mishnah Lamelech, which really is what causes the real freedom. Says the Rebbe, based on this explanation, that the ha'anaka, the gifts themselves, are very much part and parcel and connected with the freedom. It's part of the freedom is getting these gifts. Says the Rebbe, we'll now see the same idea, be able to connect this with the beer that the Rebbe's father gives in the idea of ha'anaka according to Kabbalah, which there again we'll see that the idea of the gifts are very much connected with becoming a free person. So the Rebbe's father explains that an Eved Ivri, according to Kabbalah, is on the level what's called Moichin de Katnus. He's still a very small or minor level of intellect. When he finishes his avodah, he becomes a ben chayrin, he becomes a free man, and he explains that chayrin, the level of freedom, is connected to chachma and bina, intellect, full intellect. And the Rebbe's father goes on that the pasuk says hanik tanik, a double expression of giving gifts. So he says this corresponds to chachma and bina. So when he goes out free, which again freedom is connected with going up into the level of intellect, he's now getting these gifts from the level of chachma and bina. So what do we see? Here we see the same idea, that the hanaka, the gifts, is not just another detail. He's getting a gift or payment after he's freed. But rather the gifts themselves, chachma and bina itself, is connected with the idea of freedom. Being a free man is going up to become to have these levels of chachma and bina. Says the Rebbe, based on all of this, we could also explain why there is no hanaka for an Eved Kanani, for a Goyish slave. Now simply the reason is because a Goyish slave one keeps forever, and besides in certain cases. But according to the beer of Chassidus and Avodas, in Avodas Hashem of what an Eved Kanani really means, the question is going to become a very strong question. And that is, because in Chassidus it explains that Eved Ivri and Amo Ivri in Avodas Hashem for a Yid, these are all dargas in Avodas Hashem, every one of these, including the Eved Kanani. And it says the Eved Ivri corresponds to the world of Yitzira, and Amo Ivri corresponds to the world of Bria. Now, if they need this revelation of higher levels of moichin of intellect, So surely the Evet Kanani, which is on a lower level, in the world of Asiyas, surely needs higher levels of intellect to be revealed to him. But based on the idea that we explained that Ha'anaka and freedom is really one and the same, or very connected, we're going to understand this. Because in the spiritual Avodah, the Evet Kanani always remains an Evet. What does this mean? So Chassidus explains that Evet Ivri and Amoh Ivriya, the Jewish slave and maidservant, their Avodah is more about their midos, their emotions. Whereas the Evet Kanani is serving Hashem more, again, Evet Kanani meaning a Yid that's on the Darga, the spiritual Darga of Evet Kanani, is serving Hashem more with Kabbalah soil. It says, the slave by himself would just want to be a free man. So why is he serving? Just because he's forced to serve. He's afraid of his master. So this represents a level in Avodas Hashem where he's not emotionally attached and connected, but rather he's just doing it with Kabbalah soil. Now, even though on the one hand there seems to be a much lower level than the others, nevertheless there's a certain advantage in this Avodah because of his absolute bittul, no feeling of self at all. And that's really the inner pshat of what it means that he's never freed. Why? Because in the Avodah of Evet Ivri and Amoh Ivriya, in other words, since it's connected to their own feeling, their own self, their own emotions, so there are certain limitations. And therefore, it comes to a certain end, which is represented by the idea that the slavery is over. Furthermore, the greatest shleimus in their avodah is going to be when they're finally going to complete or graduate from their avodah in the area of midos, and now they're going to go up to the level of moichin, of intellect. Whereas the Evet Kanani, which represents someone that has no desires of his own, no mitzias of his own, he's completely bottled. So here there's no room for shichur, for freedom. Why? Because number one, the avodah of Kabbalah soil, there's no feeling of self, so there's no limitation, so there's no time it comes to an end or a stop. And number two, there's no room for this ha'anaka, these gifts that are coming down, revealing higher level of intellect, because if anything, intellect is going to get in the way of his bittul, of his service of absolute Kabbalah soil. Says the Rebbe, even though we are speaking now about the mile of the Evet Kanani, this absolute bittul, nevertheless, we actually usually compare the general avodah of Am Yisrael more to an Evet Ivri. It's explained in Chassidus on the pasuk that speaks about the slave that works 6 years and the 7th year goes out free, that it also represents the 6 millennia of our world in which we do avodah, and then we finally come to the 7th millennium, which is higher than avodah. Or similar to the idea of Shabbos is the day that we rest, higher than the days of the week where we do work. So why is it that we compare generally our avodah to the Evet Ivri? If we just said Evet Kanani is the ultimate bittul, says the Rebbe, because although there's an advantage in the bittul of the Evet Kanani, but the ultimate goal is that we have both ideas together. That on the one hand, yes, we have all of our faculties, we have our pleasure, our delight, our understanding, our intellect, our emotions. It's important to have all of that, our geschmack and our avodas Hashem, but at the same time, it should be permeated with our idea of bittul. And the Rebbe concludes and says, we know Magid Dvarav L'Yaakov, whatever the Eibishter tells us to do, he does himself. And the Eibishter tells us to give the gifts and to free our slaves and to give gifts, the same thing Hashem does to us, which is that we're zoicha not only to go out free in the 7th millennium, but also to the gifts that Hashem gives us. And we know there's the concept of Toyameh Chayim Zoch. We're supposed to taste the foods already before Shabbos, before the 7th day or the 7th millennium, before Shabbos. So therefore, the Rebbe says we're supposed to be tasting now, not only from the peace and tranquility that we'll have lost, but also from the gifts of the Eibishter. And obviously, we should be zoicha to all of this, and not only the tastes, but the ultimate of it, b'poel mamish, and immediately right now.